In the year 2021, building a good gaming PC for under $500 seems like a bit of a stretch. However, behind me, I have made it work, and I've made it work really well. This gaming computer behind me can be had for around $450, and if you are willing to skimp on a few parts, which I'll go over later, you can get it for under $400. In this video, I'm going to be going over how I built it, tips for buying on eBay, and what kind of performance you can expect in this price range. Starting right off with my motherboard, I went with a Asus B450 Gaming 2 ATX motherboard. It features dual M.2 slots, cooled VRMs, built-in RGB with multiple RGB headers for Asus's proprietary RGB setup. It has discrete MOSFETs that are also cooled, and for this I only paid $63 with shipping. All the prices that I will be listing will include shipping. For my processor, I went with a AMD Ryzen 5 1600X. It features 6 cores and 12 threads. It has a base clock of 3.6 GHz and a boost clock of 4.0. It has 16 megabytes of L3 cache, which is quite a lot, and I only paid $99 for it with shipping. For my cooler, I went with a slightly antiquated but still very adequate Corsair H50 all-in-one. It's still the factory plastic and thermal pad, which means that it was never used, which is something that you want to look for in a used cooler. It features a compact single radiator design with a single 120mm fan that moves a lot of air. It did not come with an AM4 bracket, so I had to buy an adapter. However, with the adapter, I only paid $55 for it with shipping. Next up for RAM, I went with two 8GB sticks of Corsair Vengeance LPX 3200 MHz RAM. I only paid $70 for it, but they're open box, and I still got a pretty good deal on them. Next up for my graphics card, this is going to surprise a lot of you. I went with a EVGA GeForce GTX 670 Superclocked Edition. It has a base clock of around 1000 and a boost clock of around 1100 megahertz. It has 1350 CUDA cores, 4 gigabytes of GDDR5, DirectX 12 support, and OpenGL 4.4. I only paid $113 for it with shipping. This is an incredible value graphics card, especially by today's standards with that CUDA core count. And while the clock speed may be a little bit low, I've heard a lot of people can overclock these to quite a bit past their base clock. Next up for my power supply, I went with a Corsair CX500. It features black cable sleeves, multicolor cables, and I only paid $22 for it with shipping. Next up for my storage and case, I both bought these new. For storage, I went with a 500GB Samsung 980 M.2. It features read speeds of 3100 megabytes and write speeds of 2600. It is one of the fastest SSDs on the market right now. And for my case, I went with the DIY PC Flash F4 Black Edition. It's kind of like a Chinese Newegg type thing. It features a glass side and front panel, top and bottom magnetic air filters, power supply basement, so I can just kind of cram all the cables in there, and 4 RGB fans that do work, and for the low price of $49 with shipping. What's really important about this case is that it came with those RGB fans, because that really cut back on my budget. If you can find a case with fans, especially an RGB one, if you want RGB, then that's going to really help out your budget. Now on to building the computer. First went in the CPU, then I shoved in the RAM, then I forgot to install the M.2. I'll fix that later. So then I tried installing the motherboard in the case. I was having some issues with the integrated I/O shield, so I had to bend some things back. I finally laid it down and just installed it that way. I still had to bend some things back. After taking out the breakaway PCI Express slot above the one that I was supposed to take out, I finally got the graphics card in, and all was well with that. Next up was the cooler, which was a little bit janky because there wasn't much documentation on installing this specific cooler on AM4 boards, and the adapter was just in a little plastic bag, so it was kind of difficult. The adapter itself was warped in the mail, but after putting the backplate on the back of the motherboard and kind of holding it there and then jamming the adapter onto the cooler and twisting it, I finally got it to lock in place. After screwing it down with the thumb screws, I took a picture of it with my phone just to ensure that the copper block was making contact with the CPU, and it was, so all was well. Then when in the power supply, I just kind of crammed it in there. I had to use a little piece of wood to hold it up as I screwed it in. I didn't think of laying it on its side, which would have helped. Anyways, after that, I started to route the cables up. I plugged in the 20 pin, plugged in the 8 pins, I plugged in the 6 pin PCI Express connectors, and that was that. Next up, I had to install Windows, and I was having some issues because of the way that macOS formats hard drives like this one. It formats them in Apple's proprietary format scheme. I actually had to go get an old Windows computer and steal the license key off that to make a bootable flash drive, but after that, it booted right up, and this happened. This is very stupid. It's also about, well, there's something. There is a command prompt, and there we go! Jesus f***ing Christ. There we go. Boom. Boom! Oh, and look at that. So after setting the RAM to the safe speed that I've read online at least, which is 2800 megahertz for a Ryzen 5, I booted right into Windows and started installing drivers. I tried overclocking it that day, but I had some crashing errors, so I think I'll revisit that at another video. Now a few things to know about buying parts like this on eBay. All of the parts here, except for the SSD and the case, which aren't really good to buy used, came from eBay. And a few things you should definitely expect when buying used parts from eBay. 1, they're not going to arrive on time. My power supply was only shipped out the day that it was supposed to arrive, and that is pretty common. The same thing happened with my CPU. However, I ordered the CPU basically the first thing. But all I'm trying to say is don't rely on the estimated delivery dates. It could be months, it could be days before you get your product after you order it. There was one big issue with building this computer, and that was that my motherboard is hardware banned from League of Legends or Apex Legends, League of Apex or something. I'm not really big into those type of games. I literally just play CSGO, Minecraft, American Truck Simulator, although I'm banned from that right now. And then the rest of my use for this PC is mainly going to be video and photo editing. So the fact that I was banned from Apex Legends or whatever wasn't really a big deal. So in my case, the previous owner of my motherboard was caught cheating on League of Apex, or Apex Legends, and Apex Legends banned the MAC address of the integrated network card. Now what you can do is you can buy a $10 gigabit network card and throw it in there. I'm having issues with this Ethernet port with this RJ45 jack. I think that was also part of the issue that he was having. I don't really know. Maybe he tried to swap it. I don't know. But I might just end up swapping it anyway because we have over a gigabit of bandwidth here where I live, and that's only a gigabit port, so I'm probably going to want to utilize my full internet speed. Now, let's see how it performs. So, in CSGO in high settings at 144p with motion blur off, obviously, this rig performed around 80 to like 150 FPS depending on the map. If I was on a map like Office, where there's a lot of like laggy areas, such as looking outside, it would drop down to like the 80s, but if I was on a map like Dust, where there's not a lot of like rendering areas, then it would be at full like 120, 130, 140. I do want to know that this is on a 144p monitor, and my monitor is massive, so if you have a gaming monitor, it's probably going to perform a little bit better. Next, moving on to Subnautica, specifically Subnautica Below Zero, this performed very well. Even though Subnautica Below Zero is not yet optimized, it still held its own at around 50 to 60 FPS on max settings at 144p. However, if I turned it down to 1080, it performed well over 100 FPS. Moving on to Minecraft with shaders, I used BSL and Luma, and under both of those they performed very well at their recommended settings of medium and high respectively. Once I turned them both up to their ultra presets, they both performed around 60 FPS, however with periodic lag spikes. Then I tried turning the video resolution down from 144 to 1080, and they both performed very well at around 60 FPS with no lag spikes. As long as you're not running something that requires a lot of graphics RAM, you're going to be fine gaming on this. Like I said before, Subnautica Below Zero, which is an unoptimized game with ray tracing, ran pretty much perfectly on this machine, so you're not going to really run into problems unless you're going to be running the newest AAA titles. Moving on to some more professional tasks, first up is photo editing. First, I fired up Lightroom and imported some 80, 100, and 120 megabyte Lumix RAWs and tried editing them. There was no lag at all applying masks or painting anything. There was the small issue of the SD card that I was using. The SD card I was using was really not rated for editing off of the SD card, so when I imported the RAWs onto the internal SSD and then edited them from there, it worked perfectly. Next up, I tried editing 6K 10-bit clips. These are very large files, and they are very hard to edit files, mainly because they are 10-bit. But despite that, the editing was very smooth for the 6K 10-bit files. The timeline was a little bit jittery, and playback was a little bit jittery. However, that's kind of to be expected when you're editing off of an SD card. When I imported them onto the internal SSD, everything was fine. Moving on to 4K 10-bit, it was just as you would expect, a little bit better than the 6K 10-bit, and when I imported them onto the internal SSD, everything was again fine. Moving on to render/export times, a 4K 10-bit exported to 4K 8-bit in just over 4 minutes. That's like a 30-second video, and it was about 6 minutes for a 6K 10-bit clip going into a 6K 10-bit file. And I was actually really impressed with that because 6K 10-bit is really hard to export. So I think it's clear by now that this is a very, very good PC in terms of bang for the buck. However, there are a few things that you can kind of skimp on if you want to get more performance. Mainly the case. You don't need an RGB case with a ton of RGB fans. I went with it because I really wanted one, because I've never really had a computer that I can look at. I've always had Macs, which are just this like solid aluminum box that look good, but I wanted to be able to see the hardware. So that's why I went with like a glass side panel and glass front panel and all that. You can get very cheap or even used cases for much, much less. However, this one is really cheap, and DIY PC has a lot of cheaper options that you can get if you don't need like the full form factor, or if you don't need like all of the RGB fans included. They do have ones that don't have non-RGB, but are still like glass side panel. Just search up DIY PC on Newegg. They're a really good value. Next up is the RAM. I really did not need to go with 3200 megahertz RAM. And while it is nice having the 3200 megahertz available, this processor just can't handle it. More specifically, the integrated memory controller on my processor just can't handle it. I bought it because I do want to upgrade my processor eventually, but for right now, I can't utilize the full 3200 megahertz. So if you're not planning on upgrading your processor, you can probably get away with getting like 32 gigs of like 2800 for the same price that I got mine as. The graphics card is going to be a huge variable because in 3 months, the graphics card shortage could just completely go away and I might have just gotten ripped off. However, this graphics card is still pretty good by modern standards, and they still sell 4GB graphics cards that are very similar to this new. With all that being said, this is a very good looking rig, so enjoy these cinematics. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have enjoyed, make sure to subscribe by clicking on screen now. To the left and right, you can see more videos by me. Make sure to hang around for more videos that I make about this computer and other computers. Specifically, I'm going to be making one soon about why I switched from Mac to PC amid the graphics card crisis. That one's going to be interesting, so make sure to stick around for that. And as always, I'll see you next time.